Hello everybody, and welcome to a special video for the channel. In this one, I'll be going over a book, a fairly special childhood book, that I've had for quite a while. It's more of a coffee table book, and that's exactly where we're going to be going over the book, on my coffee table. But a little bit of backstory about the book. When I was a kid, I was really into arms and armor and weapons and all that sort of stuff, and my mother wanted to, help me, I guess, explore that sort of interest, and we found the Higgins Armory in Western Massachusetts, or it was formerly in Western Mass. I forget exactly where, but the place is unfortunately closed down and the collection has been moved to storage for the time being. But the Higgins Armory housed a massive collection of medieval and Renaissance armor and arms, and they also had books for sale, one of which being this here, A Visual History of Arms and Armor. This book goes over pretty much every period of history one could imagine, from, early history. Just, I think they have like sticks and spears and all that in here. Or they go from the Bronze Age all the way to modern weaponry, like, AK-47s and all that. And they cover everything in between, from medieval arming swords to Aztec obsidian weapons, and even Polynesian wooden clubs and spears, which is great because those are frequently overlooked by a lot of people when it comes to weaponry. So without further ado, I want to wish everybody a good day or a good night, whenever or wherever you are. I hope it's going well, and I'll bring the camera in and we'll take a look at this book in a bit of closer detail. And here we are. This copy is particularly well loved and fairly worn, so I'll have to be somewhat delicate with the book as I go through it. But it contains beautiful pictures of many weapons and some more descriptive sections here. Sometimes it will go into timelines of various pieces of history and outline the weapons used therein. Here you can see crossbow and the longbow, the Mongols, early firearms. But these early pages serve as an overview. As you can see, it starts out with a Assyrian simple bow and arrow, and it describes in detail various portions of the bow and arrow. Axes and clubs. This is the North American pipe tomahawk with the axe head and the iron tobacco bowl. But you can see at a glance the extreme variety that this book covers, from African throwing knives at the top here with their multiple points and edges designed to catch a man at any angle that it might land. Even medieval staffed weapons like bardashis, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, halberds, spears, on through to early firearms, early matchlocks, wheellocks, flintlocks, moving on to percussion guns, and modern repeating firearms. early modern in this case, onto what many would consider properly modern guns. It even contains many pieces of armor illustrated in the book, or photographed in the book. If it was used as a weapon of war, it is covered in this. As you can see, the first section is the ancient world, the Bronze Age. I'll skip over a lot of these timelines. I'll focus more on sections that interest me particularly. As you can see, we're beginning at the very first weapons. Generally nothing more than sharpened rocks or smooth stones. The ability of human beings to manufacture tools was an early step toward gaining mastery over their own environment. Among the first tools to appear were simple hand blades and axes made from hard rock. They would have been used to kill and dismember animals, but they also had the potential to be employed against other humans. The distinction between hunting and military weaponry necessarily remained blurred for many millennia. With the invention of the handle or shaft and the development of projectile weapons, the spear, and above all, the bow and arrow, a revolution in hunting and fighting was underway. Here at the top you can see Paleolithic blades. To be able to cut was of prime importance for early man, and these blades, dating back to about 40,000 BCE, would have been used to dismember animals that had been killed by Paleolithic hunters. Such blades were capable of severing sinew and separating the skin from the animal's flesh. Not much is actually known about who specifically made tools like these, obviously. Names and any affiliations have been lost to time. Let's move on to something interesting like this. Flint hand dagger. It's got a wooden shaft, sinew or leather binding, and the flint blade. By lashing the flint blade to a wooden shaft with a binding of sinew or leather strips, this simple hand dagger was transformed into a deadly weapon of war. The addition of the shaft enabled the Stone Age fighter to plunge the blade into his opponent with the full force of his arm. It's got quite a wide range of possible dates of origin. 2.5 million. What? That's gotta be some sort of typo. 2.5 million to 10,000 BCE. I'm not like an expert or anything, but I don't think people were around 2.5 million years ago. Or at least not the ones making tools like this. Now we move on to early civilization, the Bronze Age. In the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia. So stuff like the Assyrians or the Babylonians. Organized warfare originated in the Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia in around 3000 BCE. Armor was made from leather, copper, and bronze, and the chief weapons were the bow, pictured here, and a spear. That makes sense. Not many people would enjoy getting close to one another when it came to killing, creating provided by chariots, at first four-wheeled vehicles drawn by asses, but improved to become light horse-drawn, two-wheeled platforms for archers and spearmen. Improvements in city fortification led to developments in siege warfare techniques, such as the use of battering rams and scaling towers. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily true, but I remember reading somewhere or hearing from someone that at this point in early history, horses were not big and strong enough to support a man riding on them, especially with full armor and military kit like a sword and spear and bows and arrows and all that. So mounted cavalry, as we think of it typically, did not exist in the Bronze Age. This is a beautiful forged bronze helmet. The helmet of Mesclem Dug, made from an alloy of gold and silver. It's not bronze at all, I'm fucking stupid. Oops. Made from an alloy of gold and silver. This ceremonial helmet was found in the Sumerian city of Ur and dates back to the 3rd millennium BCE. Known as a wig helmet, as you can see, it simulates the hair at the top and across the sides and the ear. The decoration mimics the hairstyle worn by Sumerian kings of the period. So this is an alloy of gold and silver. I assume it's more ceremonial or decorative, more as a badge of office, one could assume. It's a beautiful dagger here, excavated from the burial site of the Sumerian queen Pu-Abi in around 2500 BCE. This ceremonial dagger is of the highest quality, a suitable weapon for a monarch to carry on her journey to the afterlife. The blade and scabbard are made from gold, while the hilt is constructed from lapis lazuli, finished with gold decorations. And here you can see a section of armor that was used at the time. Assyrian scale armor, constructed from bronze. This early example of lamellar armor, lamellar being small interlocking plates such as this. A more well-known example of lamellar armor is I know it's in here. Just allow me a second to find it. Here we are. This is a much more well-known permutation of lamellar armor. All samurai armor, due to the relatively poor quality of iron and steel in the region, was made of small pieces of steel, very visible on the kote, and the skirts here. Kusazuri. On the bottom, you can clearly see that they are just made of overlapping plates, small overlapping plates of steel, bound together with cordage of some description. Samurai armor was a product of the times, designed to be worn by a man on horseback very easily, and had a of metallurgy in feudal Japan. But back to ancient Assyria. An interesting note that Japan has been dealing with issues regarding poor metallurgy from the times of ancient history all the way to the Second World War. Japanese metallurgy was famous for being shoddy in a lot of cases. Almost everything that was produced in Japan had to work around those limitations, especially the swords. Katanas were not made that way because it was the best way to make a sword. It was made that way because the steel was inferior in a lot of cases, and they had to find ways to improvise and make something suitable. But let's take a look at the most famous piece of Assyrian warfare, the bows and arrows. While we know that the ancient Egyptians used composite bows of wood, horn, and sinew glued together, our knowledge of the Assyrian bows is less clear. They may have used composite bows or simple wood bows. The bow and arrows shown here are replicas. I get the feeling, since most if not all the bow is organic material, it's been lost to time and all we have are original arrowheads at this point. Now here's something very interesting from ancient Egypt, the crocodile skin armor. The crocodile was revered by the ancient Egyptians, who believed that the wearer of its skin would take on the strength and attributes of this fearsome animal. That's a fairly common belief with animals in the ancient world. A lot of cultures wore pelts ceremonially to take on aspects of those animals. I think, don't quote me on it, but I believe Aztec jaguars were the same way. And in a different way, you could imagine the legend of the Navajo skinwalker to be similar in that regard, with the medicine men taking on attributes of various animals that they wear the skins of. Crocodile cults continued into classical times, and the wearing of crocodile armor was popular with Roman soldiers garrisoned Egypt. That's also unsurprising. That would be quite a novelty for a Roman soldier to do. Mummified remains of carcass. So this is like the entire, you can see a little fucking arms. It's a little bit grim, if I'm honest with you. But you can see a lot of these bronze weapons have been preserved fairly well. This looks like some sort of... is that bronze? I'm unsure, but could very well be. I know that iron was available in some regard, but not common. Looks like that one was made out of copper on the bottom. And here we are, a pharaoh's dagger belonging to Tutankhamun, or King Tut, you know. This gold-handled dagger has an iron blade, rare in this period. The Egyptians had no direct access to iron ore, and were dependent on supplies from the Middle East, often under the control of their enemies, which consequently made the production of iron weapons a difficult business. It makes sense that was reserved for the dagger of a pharaoh. This is a beautiful, not a relief, it looks like some sort of painting of King Tut or Tutankhamun. Looks like he's fighting some sort of horde, perhaps from the African continent. Not to be crude, but just judging based on the color of their skin and this. An interesting factoid, or a fun fact, dare I say, is that Egyptians sometimes would have effigies or images of their enemies on the bottom of their sandals, so that they would be walking on their enemies with every step. Kind of a interesting little tidbit there. Move on to everybody's favorite infantryman, the Greek hoplite, or hoplite, I don't know how to pronounce it. From the 7th to the 4th century BCE, the city-states of ancient Greece had citizen armies built around heavy infantry known as hoplites, pictured here, in formation as well, shoulder to shoulder. Fighting at close quarters in tight formation, they proved more than a match for the Persian invaders at Marathon and Plataea, and fought one another in the Intercene Peloponnesian Wars. After the decline of the city-states, Greek infantry served in the all-conquering army of Alexander the Great and as mercenaries fighting for Middle East powers. You can see the famous Corinthian helmet here, the high holes and a slot in the middle for speaking. Go near, strike with a long spear or a sword at close range, and kill a man. Set foot against foot, press shield against shield, fling crest against crest. A Spartan poet, Tyrtaeus, 7th century BCE. You know, a fun fact about the Greeks, it's told that Greeks were the first ones to discover intercourse, but Italians were the first ones to discover you could have it with women as well. And here we are. Ancient Roman weapons and armor. From what I remember, this style of armor came along later. The lorica segmentata. Made of iron strips, this reproduction, lorica segmentata, was a combination of cuirass, that's the chest piece, and shoulder defense, or pauldrons, I guess you could say, was worn from early in the 1st century CE to the 3rd century CE. This armor gave the Roman legionary a reasonable degree of protection and mobility. And the quite famous Gallic helmet, originating in the Roman province of Gaul. The Gallic helmet was used widely from 50 to 150 CE. Made from iron, this replica features a deep neck guard, a short brow to deflect a sword and axe strokes away from the face. As you can see here, that little strip of metal. And you can imagine if a blow were to come in, without that it would strike the top and probably go into the eyes or something. And broad cheek guards. The cheek guards are hinged to the side of the helmet and then tied under the chin with straps or cords. You can see a very early Roman helmet. This replica helmet design dates back to 200 BCE and was based on that used by the Romans' Celtic opponents. Like the similar Culus helmet, it was made from bronze and produced in vast numbers for Roman legionaries until the mid-1st century CE. So for a lot of the time, there's very simple, this whole kind of beetle-like neck guard didn't come along until while later. After the death of Christ. I think Mel Gibson's movie does depict Roman soldiers wearing all this, which only came along after, Christ was on the cross and all that, and he was dead he died for his sins for about 100 years, and that's when this all came along. But Mel Gibson's an actor, not a historian. And here we can see the gladius, or what remains of a gladius, and its decorative scabbard. I heard somewhere that the gladius killed more people on Earth than the AK-47. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think that's anything you can even quantify remotely. That seems like just one of those things that you find on like the back of a cereal box. It's like a little fun thing to say at breakfast with your family. But the gladius and scabbard, while spears were important in softening up the enemy, the key Roman weapon was the short sword, or gladius, which the legendary legionary used to stab his opponent. Decorated in gold and silver, this magnificent ceremonial gladius was probably presented to a favored officer by the Emperor Tiberius. I assume they came to that conclusion based on these gold decorations showing Tiberius presenting his victories to stepfather Emperor Augustus. Here, portrait of the Emperor Tiberius. There, Legion Eagle, standard in a shrine. Okay. I got a whole centerfold on the Roman legionary. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. We've moved along to about the year 1000, or anywhere from 1000 to 1500, and we get some examples of how swords changed in design and use in that time. Like the base lord. I don't know how to pronounce that, man. I'm not even going to try. But it's a simple, single-edged sword. A short sword would ideally be used against lightly armored opponents. A weapon of the ordinary soldier, this sword type was popular in Northwest Europe for the 14th and 15th centuries. I was about to say the design principle seems similar to a messer. I don't know if they have one of those in there, but like a messer is kind of like a big knife. But the fact it's a straight sword with a single-edged blade with a fine point, and I would assume it was versatile in both the cut and the stab. And then as time went on, people, as you can see from this transitional sword, this sword is a transitional weapon, moving away from the classic cross-hilt medieval sword and looking ahead to the rapier of the 16th century. The short tang suggests that the swordsman's fingers would have gripped the ricasso through here, protected by a double-fingered guard. Now, some people may take that to believe he simply gripped it like that, but one could imagine that primarily the four fingers in the back, he'd try to hold it almost like a pistol, right, with one finger hooked around the top, like so, through there, and that brings the center line of the blade more in line with the center line of the forearm, making it much more easy to stab, much more intuitive. And as time went on, these two little finger guards kind of evolved to cover the entire hilt. I don't know if they get onto that. They get onto it eventually, but for right now, let's take a detour to East Asia. The swords used by Japanese samurai warriors are among the finest cutting weapons ever made. Japanese swordsmiths were elite craftsmen who used a process of smelting, forging, folding, and hammering to create curved blades that were immensely hard, but not brittle. Only the steel of the sharp cutting edge was water quenched to full hardness. The softer back of the blade, the mune, was used to block blows. The samurai carried no shield. Chinese swords, sometimes straight rather than curved, had little of the almost mystical prestige of the Japanese equivalents. That is very true. Nobody really talks about the fairly interesting history of Chinese weaponry, including me, to be honest with you. But everybody has got a lot to say of, honestly, the fairly samey looking Japanese weapons, and they attribute all these mystical powers to these swords, where in reality they were, really good at chopping, cutting and all that. But they were highly specialized to that, and they lacked a lot of versatility and use like a lot of European weapons did. And mainly because of warfare and a lot of things in Japan was highly structured. Everything was kind of in its own little box, and thinking and all that was kind of, I don't know how to politely put it. A lot of Japanese society is about fitting in, and the history of arms and armor and how they basically didn't change for a century kind of illustrates that. Well, not really a century, more like 800 years or whatever. Chinese sword. This sword, decorated with Buddhist emblems, was made for presentation to a Tibetan monastery. It is shown in its leather-covered, iron-bound wooden scabbard. Monster motif decoration on the handguard looks like some sort of lion or something. Oh, what the fuck is this? Bollock dagger. Interesting. Also euphemistically known as a kidney dagger, this weapon was named after the distinctive shape of its guard. It looks like a sort of cock and balls. Very interesting. The Bollock dagger was used throughout Europe, although it was most popular in England and the Low Countries, and equipped soldiers of all ranks. I wonder why. I wonder why it was like that. No telling. No telling, man. This illustrates the Battle of Hattin, using crossbows, arrows, swords, and staff weapons, as well as the heat of the desert. Saladin and his army defeated the Christian Crusaders in 1187 at the Horns of Hattin near Lake Tiberias in northern Palestine. The loss of this battle was a disaster that led to the destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Sim Saladin. So we got some staff weapons and all that, but I don't want to be caught up in all this too much. I want to skip ahead a little bit. Maybe show something a little bit interesting like this plate armor. can see a incredible degree of articulation in late medieval armor, and the gauntlets, and the pauldrons, and the arms. It was incredible what these smiths and craftsmen managed to accomplish with this armor. Now we're moving into the early modern world, according to the book. Here we go. Some two-handed swords. Now, this is one I do want to touch upon. The execution sword. This heavily ornate example of a municipal executioner's sword has a shorter hilt than earlier double-hander swords. Etched with depictions of gruesome executions, it was used for only one function. When not in use, the sword hung in a civic building as a deterrent to potential wrongdoers. Details and date of manufacture. Impalement by a hook. Religious exhortation. Impalement by a spike. And then beheading by the sword. One thing I want to get out of the way, a lot of people imagine executioners as like some big burly dude in a hood, when in reality the executioner was known by almost everybody. It was a public office, and he was known by everybody because nobody wanted to deal with him, because it was deemed a ugly job in a lot of cases, and people would, fairly regularly refuse to marry them or interact with them or anything like that. Just wanted to touch upon that, and the reason a lot of punishment in those times was so brutal was because a lot of crime did go unpunished, simply because they couldn't catch all these criminals a lot of the time. So when they did catch a criminal, this one looks like he's being boiled or something, I don't know. It was so brutal in their treatment as a deterrent to other people, to say, if you get caught, if we do catch you, we're gonna kill you, and we're gonna make sure you go through hell before you die. To let people know that you probably shouldn't be committing petty theft because we're gonna chop your hand off, And here we can see the basket hilt swords. Yeah, it became more and more important to protect the hand. And you can see, with this dedicated rapier, you can still see that there's a place here for you to loop your index finger to be more effective in the stab, which is also protected. You can see that evolution of the simple quillion and the two ring guards into this swept hilt and protection for the fingers. Here we go, we get some interesting daggers. This one catches my eye here, the sword breaker. One of the more extreme left-hand daggers was the so-called sword breaker. The comb-shaped steel blade was designed to trap an opponent's sword, and with a flick of the wrist, pull it from his grasp, or even break the blade. I don't know about breaking a hardened steel blade like that, but I can imagine you catching it and controlling it with that fairly easily. As you can see, they're barbed, so it's easy for a blade to enter, but difficult for it to escape. These always fascinated me as a kid, these punch daggers, I guess you could say, the katars. To use this North Indian dagger, the warrior grasped the cross grips, making a fist, so that the sidebars of the hilt lay on either side of his hand and forearm, with the blade horizontal. He then stabbed with a punching motion. The guitar's form changed little over hundreds of years. This example is from the 19th century. That means it worked. If something remains the same for like hundreds of years, that means it worked very well. Got some blunt instruments here. Warhammers and maces and such. One can imagine the proliferation of plate armor, or armor in general, that was designed to resist a stabbing or a slashing. Like even chain mail was very effective at keeping someone from cutting you up. If you just hit them with a big stick, you know, it kind of takes the wind out of their sails. Even if that mace wouldn't go through a helmet, you definitely would not want to be hit in the head with that, helmet or not. Here we are. We've got some early firearms. These in particular are European hunting guns. The gap that had existed between English gun makers and their counterparts in Europe had largely disappeared by the start of the 18th century. The flintlock now predominated, except in southern Europe, where the more primitive miquet lock was still widely used. While we see a more austere style, the remaining ornamentation became more sophisticated, with minimal ornate inlaying and emphasis placed on the natural qualities of the wood. None of these really jump out at me, to be perfectly honest. Except this one. I'm curious about that milquet, whatever the lock is called. This milquet. The I don't know how to pronounce it, man. Introduced the combined striker and pan cover, but used an external mainspring, unlike the later true flintlock, in which the mainspring was internal. Now you can see right here, that's the entire lock on display. I can see why they would consider that more primitive. You don't really want the insides of the gun on the outsides of it. This milquet lock musket is something of an oddity. It was manufactured in Naples by Pacifico around 1775, but it has what is clearly an English-made barrel, dating from around the time of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. It certainly makes it an oddity, I'll tell you that. I wouldn't consider that particularly weird, though. You could imagine if a musket was particularly well used and enjoyed, it will wear the barrel out over repeated firing, so a rebarreling is, I guess, in the cards. And here we can see that even though that the Asians might have invented gunpowder, they were considerably behind the curve when it came to firearms technology. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach the Indian subcontinent in 1498, and 45 years later they arrived in Japan. They brought with them firearms in the shape of the matchlock musket. Accomplished armorers abounded in Asia, and indigenous craftsmen soon began to copy the weapons they saw, adapting them to their own needs. They also brought the firearms to the same degree and style of decoration that they routinely applied to other weapons. This involved using precious metals and other valuable materials, and in the case of the Japanese, lacquer work. Distinctive local styles soon evolved. I heard that you can tell where a Japanese gun is made just by looking at it due to those distinctive local styles. But let's take a look at this one in the middle. It kind of jumps out at you due to the, I guess, the lacquer work on it. This 18th century, and you can see here, 18th century, right? That's a solid 200 years after this type of gun was introduced to Japan, and they're still using largely the same style of weapon. Teppo is the work of the Inami family of Sakai, who are widely held to be among the finest Japanese gun makers of the pre-industrial period. The stock is of red oak, decorated all over with karakusa scrolls and gold lacquer, with additional overlays of brass and silver. The decoration may have been added at a later date. Now, from what I understand, it was fairly common for, like many things, I guess, in Japan. One person would make the barrel, one person would make the lock and the trigger and the internals, and another person would do the wood and decoration. So there were many hands involved in this process. Hole in butt bordered by elaborate floral washer and 8-bucket water wheel design. Right here. The buttstock itself is of the form developed in Sakai. This is the actual lock plate, the mainspring. Even the mainspring is decorated. A serpentine match holder, and you would have a portion of slow match burning at all times, which would fall down to the touch pan or flash pan, and that would set the firearm off or ignite the main charge. Got the rear sight and the lacquer work. Mon is a pine tree in a circle. Let's move along a little bit. Let's jump ahead quite a bit, actually. Here we go. Sport guns. Maybe not sport guns. I'm not too interested in sporting rifles. Now here we are. Single-shot, breech-loading military rifles. This is a fairly interesting time. Not too sure why they got the Mauser above the Dreißi, considering the Dreißi preceded the Mauser, and a lot of these designs actually by a considerable margin. The Dreißi is a fairly old, very old design. 1841 this one was manufactured in. And when a lot of people think of proper breech loading, bolt action, or the Springfield with a trapdoor, or even the Martini Henrys, they think of the late 1800s. But with the Chassepot and the Dreißi, these needle guns were some of the first properly breech loading, repeating firearms. And nobody really talks about them because they're kind of weird. But it's unfortunate because the way these work, you'd still have a paper cartridge with the fulminate at the base of the bullet. So you can imagine the bullet, the primer, and then the powder behind it. And then this would all be wrapped in paper and inserted into the chamber, at which point you would close the bolt, and I believe these you had to cock the action manually afterward as well. And these are called needle fire rifles because there would actually be a long needle that would have to go through the bolt, through the through the majority of the powder and then strike the primer and ignite all that. And these needles didn't last too long because they're in the middle of an explosion every time you fire the rifle. But the Chassepot was a lot more modern, and they moved the primer from the base of the bullet to the very rear of the cartridge, as many would expect it to be. The Enfield rifle musket. Interesting, another muzzle-loading design. I wish they had the Snyder Enfield as a centerfold. I find that a lot more interesting. To be honest with you, I find breech-loader conversions of percussion guns to be more interesting than a lot of dedicated single-shot actions, personally. For example, the trapdoor Springfield I find monumentally interesting. And even like these rolling blocks, I know there were rolling block conversions of percussion guns. But the fact that, you know, you can convert something like this, what was very distinctly a musket, a muzzle-loading musket, and just convert it to this fairly slick, if anybody's operated trapdoor Springfield, it's a fairly slick action. You can get very good with it. Not as good as like a dedicated bolt gun, like a repeating bolt gun, or a lever action. But you can get fairly quick with these, and it delivers quite the punch. Fires a 45 caliber, I believe 45-70, 45-90, something like that. But these were loaded fairly hot. You know, for the time, they were big bullets, and they traveled at quite the speed. And something similar happened with these Enfield rifle muskets, where with Enfield being the pattern of rifling, I believe, and Snyder was the owner of the action, and what it was like a big plug at the back of the barrel, and you know, you flip it open. I can't really go into detail, I'm not good with this. If you want to see more about weapons like that, I highly recommend a channel on YouTube called British Muzzle Loaders. Phenomenal channel. Goes into great detail about early firearms of Britain, namely. But I've kind of gone off into the weeds a little bit, and I think it's been quite a while with this video. So I want to wish you all a good night or a good day. And remember, we're all in it together. I'm pulling for you.